The U.S. dropped out of the top 25 of the least corrupt nations in this year's Corruption Perceptions Index. Out of 180 countries, the U.S. got beat out by countries like Denmark, Finland, and New Zealand. The report cited America's issue with attacks on free and fair elections. Meanwhile, Bridgewater Associates founder Ray Dalio said there's a chance that Americans on both sides of the aisle will be reluctant to accept the results of the coming 2024 election. Earlier this month, the billionaire praised China's prosperity while urging the U.S. to narrow wealth gaps.
Editor-in-chief at The Real News and host of Working People podcast, Max Alvarez, and culture editor at The Federalist, Emily Jashinsky, are here to join us. Thank you both for coming. So, Emily, I couldn't help but notice that the United Arab Emirates had scored higher than the United States on this, list of, corrupt and non-corrupt countries. What do you make of this list and our falling, below 25?
That's why I absolutely hate the metrics these random nonprofits come up with, because often the standards are impossible to apply across different countries because the way different countries do things are just so backwards. And when you have people like Dalio, such a great example, praising China for any number of things, you bring in these biases in certain directions. And again, it's just really, really hard to compare what constitutes a free and fair election on those sort of marginal issues across countries. We should have a standard for what looks like a free and fair election, of course. But when you're trying to compare the United States to all of these different countries that operate their elections in vastly different ways, I mean, come on, and who knows who funds these nonprofits and who funds these researchers? It's just always a jumble. It's always a waste of time, and they come up with sillier metrics like I could get into it, but I'll leave it there.
Yeah, Max. And then on that second point, while it's true that no one has gone as far to sort of call into question the integrity of the election as Donald Trump in this last round, you did have statements casting some doubt on the result from Hillary Clinton and other people previously. Now, Trump has, to be clear, set a new low, but we can always go now. Will the other side go even lower next time if he were to make a comeback?
Right. I mean, and just to, I guess, kind of piggyback on what Emily was saying, right? I was worried I was going to have to be that guy, but thankfully we're all in agreement here that, the metrics for this study, and this is not the first time it comes out, I guess, for people watching, right? They're very, very sketchy, and I honestly think there's very little that we can tell from this kind of study. And at the very end of this Daily Mail article, it's literally the last sentence, it says, quote, compiled since 1995, the index is calculated using 13 different data sources that provide perceptions of public sector corruption from business people and quote-unquote country experts. Sources include the World Bank, the World Economic Forum, and private risk and consulting companies. So, why?
Your
why
best friends, the people I know that you trust the most, right?
Right? It's like the most foxes guarding the hen house crap I've ever seen. So I'm I don't really care how you guys define corruption. And and there is, a larger discussion that others have had about how the way that this looks at corruption is actually very problematic because it really limits the scope to, again, this perception of faith in public officials or people in public positions using their power for their own ends, which is obviously a problem that everyone should be concerned with. But it does not take into account, right, the systematized corruption and pillage that so many countries are, experiencing, including very much so the United States. I mean, geez, for months ago, we just had the Pandora Papers blow up, and it showed all the different ways that, in fact, it's not just local officials in certain countries, the majority of which happen to be, in the global south, and it's either black, brown, or Asian countries that are the most corrupt. But it limits the scope to the national side, and it doesn't show the larger, I think, economic systems that are a lot of people in a lot of different countries are participating in. There was just a massive study done by the Institute for Policy Studies, Oxfam, the Fight for Inequality Alliance, and Patriotic Millionaires that showed how that systematized corruption is impacting countries across the board, and that divide between the haves and the have-nots has gotten greater and greater because of institutionalized, systematized corruption that we don't really define in whatever BS study this is.
So Max, let me bring you back to the domestic question here. So according to a new NBC poll, both the Democratic and Republican parties are extremely unpopular with the American people. 44% of people surveyed said that they view the GOP negatively, and 48% said that they view the Democratic Party negatively. So, you know what, I mean, you know, people really hate when we both sides things, right? You know, one gets a lot of, you know, pushback for that. But what's going on here? Why are both parties, you know, so in the toilet when it comes to ratings? Let's start with you, Emily.
Because they haven't been serving the public, they haven't been serving their voters. The party establishments are drifting further and further from what their constituents actually want. You see that on both sides. You see the sort of Republican establishment struggling to serve Republican voters and sort of doing it begrudgingly when they have to, but usually it's just on the surface with messaging. And of course, this is a huge problem on the left. And Max, I'm sure, could launch into all of the reasons why the Democratic establishment doesn't serve the base of the party. But I think that's the bottom line. And I think for all the talk of a realignment, I think it's sort of what's really happening beneath the surface is almost transpartisan. I think a lot of these issues, like Max and I did a whole podcast last week on labor issues and the labor movement and where sort of conservatives can come to the table and really talk through these difficult issues that they've pushed off for so long. And I think in a way, issues like that, it's more than a realignment. It's also just sort of becoming, these issues are becoming transpartisan in a way, and where things fall, I don't know, but the parties are, you know, they're serving the public worse than I can remember them ever doing before.
Yeah, and so we've obviously been doing a lot of, I think, well-deserved mockery of this idea that of corruption perceptions and how they're determining this. But I guess I do want to, I mean, Max, like, it is true that, I mean, like the Trump administration had members of the Trump family serving in top roles. Maybe some of this is not new. I don't want to, you know, absolutely pretend that everything was all fine and, you know, now just corruption has begun because of Trump. But I think there is a way in which our political figures have become more, I don't know, involved in like the entertainment industry, or just like they're just being celebrity figures. And I'm not even like just talking about Trump. But there probably is rising corruption in how our political figures behave, or the unaccountability of some of our bureaucracies. Our national security officials, urging everything's fine in Afghanistan. Stay the course. Stay the course. You know, Biden has to do this tremendously unpopular pullout to overcome the lies he's being fed from the deep state. So, Max, you think it is? I think it's fair in some sense, maybe not in the way they're quantifying it, to say that actually, yes, our government has gotten more corrupt.
I think that's a really important point, right? Yeah, because like I don't mean to say, right, you know, this study is crap, no one should listen to it, thus America's doing fine, right? I mean, like we're not, in case anyone was wondering, right? And I think that you're right, Robbie. And these two things are very much connected. Like, one of the things that Emily and I talked at length about on her podcast last week, and I was very appreciative of the opportunity, right, is like this kind of very obvious fact, right, that for years and decades, working people have been screwed over, right? They have been more productive than ever. Their share of that productivity has gone down. Cost of living has gone up. Wages for most workers have been stagnant for 40 years. And yet, the two parties that keep saying we're going to fix things for you, A, keep not doing that, and B, keep getting more and more brazen in their attempts to do the opposite, right? There's just such a callous abandon with which our political establishment, both on the Republican and Democratic side, are showing their disdain for the average working person, because they have this confidence that they'll never really face any consequences for it. We're literally having, in the Democratic side, we're having senators basically try to beg, the party elites that, we should maybe curtail our ability to do insider trading. And Nancy Pelosi et al. Is saying like, no, it's totally fine. And workers over here are just like, like, are you kidding me? Like, is anyone going to do anything about this? So it's this, and it creates a feedback loop, right? Because the more that you see your public institutions fail you, and the more you see that callous disregard with which they treat working people, the less faith that you have in it. And then, it just kind of keeps feeding and feeding until something's going to break. And I don't think that any party right now is serious about finding a solution to that, which is why Emily and I talked about ways that working people can come together and work towards collective solutions to their problem, be they in the labor movement or elsewhere. But right now, it's not happening in the realm of electoral politics.
We need to all love ourselves as much as Congress loves playing with stocks. That's what we should all aspire to.
Amen, brother. Amen.
Max and Emily, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys.
We'll be back with more Rising right after this.